The fire was already through the second floor when the woman in the grey custodial uniform walked back into the building everyone else was running out of. She had clocked out 4 minutes earlier. Her shift at the Community Arts Centre ended at 6, and at 6 she had hung her cleaning cart in the supply closet, signed the log, and stepped into the cold. The smoke alarm started its long mechanical scream before she reached the bus stop. By the time she turned around, 2 staff members were on the sidewalk counting heads, and the count was coming up 1 short. A boy named Theo, 8 years old, in the after-school program, had gone back for his drawing. Nobody had seen him come out. The woman in the grey uniform did not wait for the fire trucks. She handed her bag to a stranger and went in. Her name was Nadia Cole, and 3 days later it would be in the newspaper, and a man who had spent 6 months pretending her job application did not exist would read it over his morning coffee and feel the floor tilt under him. She had no idea any of that was coming. She only knew there was a child somewhere above her, and that she knew the building better than anyone alive because she had cleaned every inch of it 5 nights a week for the better part of a year. If you have ever been the person nobody looked at twice, the one who kept a place running while the people who ran it forgot your name, stay with this one. You are going to want to see how it ends. Nadia was 34. She had a son of her own, a quiet 7-year-old named Marcus, who slept with a flashlight because the apartment they rented had a furnace that knocked at night and scared him. She kept the flashlight charged for him without ever saying a word about it, because she understood that a fear you are not mocked for is a fear you can outgrow. She had been a nurse once. That was the part nobody at the Arts Centre knew because nobody had ever asked. She had spent 6 years in paediatric intensive care at a hospital across the river. 6 years of holding small hands through long nights, of reading monitors and reading parents, and learning that the second was harder than the first. It had been the nurse the families asked for by name, the one who stayed past her shift when a mother could not bear to leave a bedside alone, the one who knew how to tell a 7-year-old the truth about a needle in a way that made the truth survivable. She had a way of leaning in close and saying a child's name first before anything else so that the child knew they were a person and not a procedure. She had been good at the thing in a way that is rare and that cannot be taught, and then the layoffs came, and her unit was folded into another, and her position was eliminated with a form letter and 2 weeks of pay. She had a license that was still valid and a resume that still said what she had done, and for 11 months she had been mailing that resume into a silence so complete it had started to feel like a verdict. The custodial job paid $14 an hour. She took it because Marcus needed shoes, and the rent did not care what she used to be. She cleaned the art centre at night after the after-school programs emptied out and the lights in the offices went dark. And she was good at it, the way she was good at everything, thoroughly and without complaint, and she learned the building. She learned which stairwell door stuck in the cold and which one swung free. She learned that the third-floor art room had a window that opened onto a flat section of roof because she had to prop it open in summer to clear the smell of turpentine. She learned where the old fire escape was, the one bolted shut years ago and forgotten behind a stack of folding chairs in the storage room. She learned the names of the after-school kids too, where you learn the names of plants you water without anyone telling you to. She knew Theo because he stayed latest, waiting for a mother who worked a shift that ran long, and because he drew on every scrap of paper he could find and left them behind, and because once, when he had been crying in a hallway over something, an older boy had said, she had crouched down and asked him to show her what he was drawing, instead of asking him why he was crying, and he had shown her, and the crying had stopped. She had no reason to know any of this. She knew it because knowing the place she worked, and the people in it, was simply who she was. So when the count came up short, Nadia did not think about the $14 or the form letters or the 11 months. She thought about a stairwell that stuck and a window onto a roof, and she went in through the side door that the smoke had not reached yet, and she went up. The fire had started in a wiring panel on the second floor and was climbing. The hallway lights were out. The smoke sat at the ceiling like a low grey ocean, and Nadia did what she had taught 100 frightened parents to do in another life. She got low. She put her sleeve over her mouth and she moved along the wall, counting doors by touch, because she had cleaned this hallway so many times she could have walked it blind. And that night she nearly had to. She knew the side stairwell would be passable a few minutes longer than the main one because the side stairwell had a door at the bottom that sealed tight, a door she had complained about more than once because it stuck and pinched her cart, and the thing she had cursed for a year was the thing that kept the smoke from filling the stairwell ahead of her. She went up it 2 steps at a time with her heart going hard, and she told herself the same thing she had told scared parents. On the worst nights, that panic is a passenger, and you do not let the passenger drive. Theo was in the 3rd floor art room where she had guessed he would be, crouched under a table with his drawing clutched to his chest and his eyes streaming, too frightened to move. He had done everything wrong, and everything a scared child does. He had gone up instead of down toward the thing he wanted, instead of away from the danger. The room was the one she dusted on Tuesdays, the one with the long window and the shelves of dried tempera and the radiator that ticked, and she knew its furniture in the dark the way you know the furniture of your own house when you get up at night for water. She crossed it low and fast, her hand trailing the edge of the supply counter she wiped down twice a week, and she found him by the sound of his coughing, a small, wet hitching sound under the 3rd table from the wall. She did not yell at him. She got down under the table with him on her knees, and she put her face close to his, and she said his name, just his name, the way you say a name to someone who has stopped believing anyone is coming. "Theo," she said. "Theo, I've got you. I know the way out, and we're going to take it together." His eyes were enormous and his lips were grey at the edges, and he shook his head and pressed the drawing harder against his chest, because, at 8 years old, the loss of the drawing and the loss of his life had become the same size of terrible, and he could not tell them apart. She did not try to take the drawing from him. She had learned a long time ago, in another life, that you do not win a frightened child by force. "Keep it," she told him. "Hold it tight and don't let go. We're going to bring it with us. You and me and the picture, all 3. Something in the way she counted the 3 of them, like the drawing was a passenger too, loosened the grip of his fear by a degree, and he let her get an arm around him. The window onto the roof was 12 feet away. The door back to the stairwell was a wall of heat by then. Nadia wrapped the boy in a paint-stained smock from the supply shelf, soaked it at the slop sink in 30 seconds of fumbling, and carried him to the window she had noticed months ago and never once imagined she would need. The window stuck the way the stairwell door stuck, and for one bad second it would not give. And she set the boy down and put both hands under the sash and her whole weight into it, and it gave, and the cold air came in like a rope thrown to a drowning person. Tad. She got him out onto the flat roof, into the clean dark, and she climbed out after him and held him against her on the gravel, while the heat pressed at the window behind them. He was still holding the drawing. He had never let it go. She stood there in the dark, holding a stranger's child, while the ladder truck swung its arm toward them and the spotlight found them, and a firefighter she would never see again, a young man with soot on his face and a steadiness in his voice, leaned across the gap and said, "I've got him, ma'am. Hand him here," and took the boy from her arms, and only then, with her arms suddenly empty. Did Nadia let herself feel how close it had been? She did not let herself shake until they were both on the ground. Then she sat on the curb with a blanket around her shoulders and an oxygen mask on her face, and she shook for a long time. And a paramedic told her she had a mild case of smoke inhalation and a burn on her forearm where a section of her sleeve had caught and she had not even felt it. The burn was the length of a finger and it would scar, and she looked at it under the streetlight with a strange detachment, the way you look at a thing that happened to someone else. Theo's mother found her on that curb. The woman's name was Carla, and she worked nights at a distribution warehouse and had run the last 6 blocks from the bus when the call reached her, and she arrived to find her son alive and wrapped in a firefighter's coat and a stranger in a grey uniform sitting on the curb with a burn she had not felt. Carla did not say anything for a moment. She just knelt down on the wet pavement in her good coat, the coat she wore for things that mattered, and put her arms around the custodian who had walked into a fire for a child she cleaned up after, but had never been introduced to, and the 2 of them stayed like that, while the building burned behind them, 2 working women on a curb in the cold. One of them shaking and one of them holding her still. Nobody got Nadia's name that night. In the noise and the lights and the chaos, she gave her statement to an officer, declined a ride to the hospital because she could not afford the bill and would not say so, and took the late bus home to her son. She did not think she had done anything that required a name. She had done what was in front of her. That was the whole of it. What she did not know was that a reporter from the city paper had been 3 blocks away, covering a council meeting, had heard the trucks, and had arrived in time to photograph a woman in a grey uniform handing a child across a 12-foot gap to a ladder truck. The reporter had spent the next 2 days finding out who she was. And on the 3rd morning, the story ran on the front page of the Metro section, above the fold, under a headline about an off-duty nurse and a custodian who turned out to be the same person, and it carried her full name, Nadia Cole. Across the river, in a corner office on the 14th floor of a regional hospital network's administrative tower, a man named Walter Bishop unfolded that paper next to his coffee and read the first 3 paragraphs and then read them again, because the name had reached out of the page and closed a hand around his throat. Walter was 58. He had been the director of talent acquisition for the hospital network for 9 years, which meant that every nursing application that came into the system eventually passed under his authority. And he had built a reputation for efficiency that the executives above him admired and the people below him feared. He ran a lean operation. He had cut the hiring timeline. He had a system, and the system had a rule. He had made himself a rule he had repeated in meetings as a point of pride, that any applicant with a gap in employment longer than 6 months went to the bottom of the pile and stayed there unless someone made a case for them, because in Walter's experience a gap meant a problem. And the network did not have time for problems. 11 months earlier, an application had come into his system from a pediatric ICU nurse with 6 years of experience and an employment gap that had just crossed the 6-month line. Walter had not read it. His assistant had flagged it under the rule, and Walter had glanced at the flag and not the file, and her application had gone to the bottom of the pile where it had sat unread for half a year and then longer, while the woman who submitted it cleaned a building at night for $14 an hour and mailed her resume into the silence he had personally constructed. He knew the name because his system knew the name. He pulled it up on his screen with hands that were not quite steady, and there it was, a file he had never opened, time-stamped and routed and buried, and attached to it a cover letter he read now for the first time, in which a woman explained in plain, careful words that she had been laid off when her unit was consolidated, that she had kept her license current, that she had taken other work to support her son while she searched, and that she would bring everything she had to any unit that would have her. He read it twice. Then he looked at the newspaper photograph of that same woman handing a child out of a burning building, and Walter Bishop, who prided himself on never being wrong, understood with a sick and total clarity exactly what his rule had done. Have you ever realized all at once that something you were proud of was the very thing you should have been ashamed of? Hold on to that feeling. He was about to spend a long time inside it. What Walter did next is the part of this story that matters, because a smaller man would have closed the file and let the silence go on doing its work. He did not. He sat in his office with the paper and the unopened application, side by side, and he made himself look at both for a long time. And then he picked up his phone and cancelled his morning, and he began the slow and humiliating work of finding out how many other names were sitting at the bottom of his pile for the same reason hers had been. It took him most of the day. He pulled every application his rule had buried in the past 3 years, and he read them, one after another, the gaps that he had treated as verdicts and that turned out, when he actually read the words, to be lives. A nurse named Dolores, who had taken 18 months off to care for a dying mother, and who had written in a single steady sentence at the bottom of her letter that she had held her mother's hand at the end and would bring the same steadiness to any patient who needed it. A respiratory therapist who had survived cancer and come out the other side wanting to work, who had attached his clearance letter and a note that said only that he understood now, from the inside, what a frightened patient feels. A new graduate who had spent a year as a caregiver for a brother with a brain injury and had learned more about patients in that year than any unit could have taught her. He had buried them all. His efficiency had a body count, and it was made of exactly the kind of people his hospitals existed to serve. He read until the light went orange in the windows and the cleaning crew came through, and one of them, a man pushing a cart very like the one Nadia had pushed, paused in his doorway and asked if he could empty the bin, and Walter looked at the man for a long moment, really looked, and said, "Yes, and thank you," and asked him his name. The man's name was Reggie, and he had worked the 14th floor for 6 years, and Walter had never once asked. He did not tell anyone what he was doing. He just read, and somewhere in the middle of that long day, Walter understood that an apology made privately to himself was worth nothing, and that the only currency that meant anything now was action, and that the woman whose name was on the front page deserved the first of it. Meanwhile, across the river, Nadia was having a very different day. The story had run with her name and her face, and her quiet life had cracked open. Carla had organized a fund to cover her medical bills, the bills she had been too proud to mention, and the fund had filled in a single morning from strangers who had read the story and wanted to do something with the way it made them feel. People left small notes with the money. A retired nurse wrote that she remembered what it was to be the one who stayed. A man wrote that his daughter had been pulled from a car once by someone who never gave a name, and that he had been waiting 30 years to pay it forward. A local news crew had come to the art centre, which was closed now, its second and third floors gutted, and the windows boarded, and a faint smell of char still hanging in the cold air, and had filmed Nadia standing in front of the boarded entrance, saying she had only done what anyone would have done, which was not true. And everyone watching knew it was not true, and that was part of why they could not stop watching her. The reporter on camera asked her what was going through her mind when she turned around at the bus stop and saw the smoke. And Nadia thought about it for a moment and said that she had been thinking about which window, not whether to go in. Which window? And the reporter did not have a follow-up question because there was nothing to add to that. She did not feel like a hero. She felt tired and her forearm hurt under the dressing. And she was worried about money because the art centre was closed and her $14 an hour had stopped, and a fund for hospital bills did not pay the rent or buy the shoes. She sat at her kitchen table that night with Marcus doing his homework across from her and a stack of bills she could not yet pay, and she thought, with the particular exhaustion of a person who has done a brave thing and woken up to find the world unchanged, that being seen was not the same as being safe. Then her phone rang and the number was the hospital network across the river, the one whose silence she had stopped expecting anything from, and a man with a careful, steady voice asked if he was speaking to Nadia, and said his name was Walter and that he was calling to apologize. E almost hung up. She thought it was a reporter or a scam or a cruelty. The man on the phone did not ask her for anything. He told her plainly that he was the person who decided which applications got read and which did not, and that hers had come into his system 11 months ago, and that he had not read it, and that the reason he had not read it was a rule he had made, and that the rule was wrong, and that he was sorry. He did not soften it. He did not explain it away. He said the words a person says when they have decided to stop protecting themselves, and Nadia, who had spent 11 months wondering what was wrong with her, that her resume vanished into nothing, sat very still at her kitchen table and listened to a stranger tell her that nothing had been wrong with her at all. She did not say it was all right, because it was not all right, and she was not a woman who lied to make other people comfortable. She let the silence sit on the line for a moment, the way she had once let silence sit in a hospital room, when there was nothing to say that would not be a lie. "I appreciate the call," she said at last. "I do. I just wish you'd read it 11 months ago." Her voice did not rise and it did not break. "I spent a long time thinking there was something wrong with me. My son watched me check the mail every day. I told him good things take time. He's 7. He believed me." She stopped there because she was not trying to wound the man, only to tell him the true shape of what his rule had cost. And Walter on the other end of the line understood that he had just been handed something more devastating than any anger could have been. He had been handed her grace. And grace from someone you have wronged is the heaviest thing in the world to carry. Across the river, he sat in his dark office with the newspaper still open on the desk, and he said simply that she was right and that he was sorry, and that he would not insult her by pretending he could give her those 11 months back. He could only try to be worth the next ones. He asked if she would come in and talk. Not for the job, he said, though he hoped she would consider it. He wanted Thirst to sit across from her and say what he had said now to her face, because he believed the wrong done in person should be answered in person. Nadia looked across the table at her son, who had stopped doing his homework and was watching her with the careful attention of a child who has learned to read his mother's face for weather, and she said yes. The morning she went to the hospital tower, she wore the one good outfit she owned, the plain dark blazer she had bought for interviews that never came. She took 2 buses to get there. She sat in a glass and marble lobby that was colder and grander than anything in her own working life, and she watched people in suits move through it with the unhurried confidence of people who had never once mailed a resume into silence, and she felt every inch of the distance between that lobby and her kitchen table. Then a man came down to meet her himself instead of sending an assistant, a heavy-set man in his late 50s with tired eyes and a careful way of holding himself. And he crossed the lobby and put out his hand and said her name like it cost him something to say it, and she understood that this was the man from the phone. They did not talk in his office. He took her to a small room with a window and 2 chairs and a pot of coffee, and he poured her a cup before he poured his own. And he sat down across from her, and he told her the rest of it. He told her about the rule, and about the day he had spent reading the applications it had buried, and about the lives he had found at the bottom of his own pile. He told her about Dolores and the dying mother, and about the therapist who understood fear from the inside now, and about a custodian named Reggie who had worked outside his door for 6 years, whose name he had only learned the night before. He did not perform his guilt for her. He laid it out, like a man laying tools on a table, plainly, so she could see exactly what he had done and exactly what it had cost. Nadia listened with her hands around the warm cup, and she did not help him through the hard parts, did not nod him along or wave it away, because she understood that a man saying these things needed to say all of them, and that the kindest thing she could do was let him reach the end of it under his own weight. When he was finished, there was a silence in the small room, and then he did the thing that Nadia had not expected, the thing that turned the whole encounter from an apology into something larger. He asked her to help him fix it. He had a pediatric unit that needed nurses, he said, and he would offer her a position in it today, at a salary that reflected her 6 years of experience, and he hoped she would take it, because she was exactly the nurse those children needed, and he had wasted 11 months keeping her from them. He wanted more than that, though, if she was willing. He wanted her to look at his hiring system, the whole of it, the rule she had been buried under and every rule like it, and tell him what it did to the people on the other side of it, the people it treated as gaps instead of lives. He could not undo what his efficiency had cost. He could build something better in its place, and he could not do it alone, because he had proven. He could not see the thing clearly from where he sat. He needed someone who had been on the bottom of the pile to help him take the pile apart. Nadia did not answer right away. She sat with the coffee going cold between her hands, and she thought about the 11 months, and the $14 an hour, and the night her sleeve had caught fire, and she had not felt it. She thought about Marcus and his flashlight, and the shoes, and the furnace that knocked. And she thought about the cover letter she had written, the one this man had finally read, in which she had promised to bring everything she had to any unit that would have her. She had meant it then, and she meant it now. She said yes to the job, and then she said that she would help him with the system, but only on one condition. And Walter leaned forward to hear it, and she said that she would not let it be a quiet fix that made the network look good. The names at the bottom of his pile were owed more than that. If they were going to do this, they were going to do it out loud, so that the people who had been buried knew that someone had finally dug them out. Walter, who had spent 9 years being admired for his efficiency, looked at the woman across the table, whose application he had not bothered to read, and he agreed. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale, because Nadia did not live in one. She started on the pediatric unit and found, as she had known she would, that 6 years of skill do not evaporate in 11 months of silence, and that the children took to her way frightened children always had, and that the work she had thought was lost to her had been waiting the whole time for someone to read the file. On her third shift, she sat with a 6-year-old who would not stop crying before a procedure, and she did the thing she had always done, leaned in close and said the child's name first, before the gown or the line or the needle, and asked her what she liked to draw. And by the time the doctor came in, the child was telling Nadia about a cat she was going to draw with purple stripes, and the crying had stopped, and a resident in the doorway watched it happen, and understood that he had just seen something no textbook had taught him. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The only thing that had ever stood between her and the work was a rule made by a man who had never met her, and the rule was gone now, and so she did the thing she was made to do, and the doing of it healed something in her that the fund and the headlines never could have. And she kept her condition. She and Walter sat down with the buried applications, the real ones, the lives at the bottom of the pile, and one by one Walter made the calls he should have made years earlier. He hated making them at first, because each one began with him saying his name and his title, and then the long pause while the person on the other end decided whether to trust a voice from a place that had ignored them. Not all of them answered. Some had moved on, found other work, stopped expecting anything from a network that had ignored them. One woman told him, not unkindly, that she had found a job that valued her 8 months ago and would be staying, and that she hoped he would do better by the next one, and Walter wrote that down on a legal pad, and kept the pad where he could see it. Some answered, though, and Dolores, the nurse who had cared for her dying mother, came in for an interview and sat across from Nadia, who had asked to be in the room, and answered the questions steadily until the last one, and then she went out to the parking lot and wept against the side of her car because she had decided she was finished, that nobody wanted her, that the gap on her resume had become her whole identity, and someone had finally told her it had not. Nadia followed her out and stood with her in the cold, and did not say anything wise, only put a hand on her shoulder, and waited the way someone had once waited for Nadia on a curb with a blanket. The respiratory therapist who had survived cancer took a position in a unit 2 floors below Nadia's, and on his first day he found her on her break and shook her hand and could not finish the sentence he had come to say, so he just held the handshake a beat too long, and she understood it anyway. The new graduate who had cared for her injured brother was hired into a residency program, and she turned out to be one of the best in her class, because patience, it happened, was exactly the thing the work required, and she had a year of it that no school could have given her. Walter did it out loud, the way Nadia had insisted. He stood up in front of the executives who had admired his efficiency, and he told them what his efficiency had cost, and he did not spare himself. And some of them were uncomfortable, and some of them were quietly relieved that someone had finally said it. And the rule about the 6-month gap was struck from the system and replaced with a process that required a human being to actually read the words a person had written about their own life before deciding that life was a problem. They named the new review process after nobody. Nadia would not allow it to be named after her, and she would not allow it to be named after the fire. She said the work was the point, not the story, and that a name on a process was just another way of making it about the people at the top, instead of the people it was meant to serve. So it had a plain, bureaucratic name that nobody would ever remember, and that was exactly how she wanted it, because the people it dug out of the pile would not remember the name either. They would only remember that someone had finally read their file. There is a thing that happens to people who have been overlooked for a long time. When they are finally seen, it does not make them cruel. The world expects them to come up swinging, to take the recognition and turn it into a weapon against the people who withheld it, and sometimes that is what happens, and no one could blame them. Nadia did not do that. She had been handed every reason to make Walter pay for the 11 months, and she could have in a dozen quiet ways, and she did none of them. She worked beside him on the thing they were building, and she let him carry his own guilt without lightening it for him, and without sharpening it either, and slowly, over those weeks, the man learned something from the woman he had wronged that 9 years of admired efficiency had never taught him, which was how to see a person before he saw a problem. Theo, the boy from the fire, came to find her at the hospital one afternoon. His mother brought him. He was shy, and he held his mother's hand, and he had brought Nadia the drawing, the one he had gone back into a burning building to save, the one that had nearly cost them both their lives. It was a child's drawing of a house with too many windows and the sun in the corner with a face on it, and he had added something to it since the fire. In the doorway of the house, he had drawn a tall figure in grey, and when Nadia asked him who it was, he looked at his shoes and said it was the lady who came to get him. She kept that drawing. She did not frame it and hang it where visitors would see it and ask about it, because that would have made it a trophy, and it was not a trophy. She put it inside the front cover of the binder she carried on her unit, the one with all her patients' charts in it, so that every shift, when she opened the binder to begin her work, the first thing she saw was a house with too many windows and a tall figure in grey standing in the door, waiting to be let in. Months later, on a quiet evening in the new apartment, the one with a furnace that did not knock, and a second bedroom, so Marcus did not have to sleep with a flashlight anymore, Nadia sat at a kitchen table that was hers, in a home she could afford, after a shift, doing the work she was made for, and she thought about the long silence she had mailed her life into, and how close she had come to believing it was an answer. Marcus was asleep down the hall without the flashlight on, which was its own quiet kind of proof that something had changed. It had not been an answer, the silence. It had been a man's rule, and a rule could be changed, and the only reason it changed was that a boy went back for a drawing and a custodian knew where the window was. She had thought, on her worst nights in the old apartment, that the world had simply decided she was finished, and the world had not decided any such thing. A few people in an office had built a wall out of habit, and they had never once seen the people standing on the other side of it, and all it had taken was for one of those people to become impossible to ignore. She had not gone into the fire to be seen. She had gone in because a child was inside, and she knew the way. The world had seen her anyway, and through being seen she had been dug out of a pile she had not even known she was buried in, and she had stayed to dig out the others. That was the part she was proudest of in the end. Not the fire, not the headline, the others. If this story moved you, take a moment to think about the last person you walked past without seeing, the one keeping some building of your life running while you forgot their name. And if you want another story about a person the world overlooked until it could not anymore, there is one waiting for you. About a man who delivered packages to the same house for 9 years before he learned whose house it was. Nadia opened her binder at the start of every shift. The drawing was always there. A house with too many windows, a sun with a face, and a tall figure in grey in the doorway, finally inside.